Good afternoon. How you doing? Everyone having fun with this World Cup? For those who follow soccer, I'm sure most of the world does, and a growing population here in the United States supports soccer. Now, this video I've been wanting to do for some time now. It regards Canadian-U.S. relations, which are in a crisis. Americans I believe, have always taken Canada for granted. The relationship between Canada and U.S. is like bickering cousins. Many Canadians resent the fact that people confuse them for Americans, obviously because we're on the same continent, but we are a very different type of people. From my observation, Americans tend to be a very more impulsive people, a very gregarious people. Canadians, and here's where I think Canadians get it right. They're non-impulsive, they carefully things out, and they're very articulate, which is something that is a benefit to Canada. Now, how did the U.S. and Canada ever relationship? It was before Trump. The relationship underneath the friendly gratitudes has always been rocky, to say the least. It actually started at the time of the Revolution, and there were some Americans that continued to push it into the 19th century. Yes, Americans, we wanted to annex Canada. This is where the issue of the 51st state, why Canadians get really upset over the 51st state threat put out by certain people. Apparently, it continued into the early 19th century, and this is what the basis of part of the War of 1812. And the War of 1812 is what defined Canadian-U.S. relations. U.S. invaded Canada, we burnt down York, and then 2 years later, the Canadians watched as the White House gets burned in Washington, D.C., I'm sure with some gratitude after what was done in York and some other Canadian towns. Well, the war ended, and an easy peace between the U.S. and Canada reigned for the rest of the 19th century with mutual suspicion for obvious reasons. And then, in the beginning of the 20th century, you had what really, I think, started the modern Canadian relationship happened was with Franklin D. Roosevelt and Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King, I think, was the ones that really tried to smooth the relationship out between the U.S. and Canada. And it benefited both countries for a long time. Again, the past was always there, but there was generally good feelings. And Kennedy went to Canada in 1961 and addressed the Parliament, in which he says, what about something about being borders and not us tear asunder? Nice words, but the reality was, even with during the years of stability, there were still suspicions in Canada. And with the election of Justin Trudeau's father, he made a very comment about what it's like living next to an elephant, which I'm sure many Americans took as being offended. I don't think many Americans have ill feelings, and many of them do believe Canada's its own country. The problem is, in this country, and I'm going back to my country, is that we study Europe, but we don't study our own continent. The only Canadian studies I've ever seen is either in the Northeast, where Massachusetts, New York, obviously, because of the border, or maybe Montana or some of the plain states, but not the rest of the country. The United States really has to teach Canadian studies in the United States as one way to unease the problems that we have now. Now, where we are in 2026, in the last 2 years of crisis, with boycotts, travel, well, Canadians just simply got fed up and just wanted to teach the United States a lesson. And I don't blame them for one bit. But Canadians need to be mindful. And I understand when your foreign minister said that we have a more European mindset. That's true, because Canada used to be a dominion of is still part of the Commonwealth of countries. But I want Canadians to be mindful that regardless of that you are still part of the North American continent. You can't, I'm sure most Canadians would like to move to Europe, but physically you can't do that. The United States, for all intents and purposes, is its only neighbor, really. And we would be there if Russia tried to attack the Arctic. Now, when Prime Minister Carney says that the world is changing, he is correct. I was really impressed with Prime Minister Carney's speech this year at Davos, in which he said the world is changing. It is changing, and Americans have got to adjust to that fact. Now, the world is in this unstable situation we haven't seen since the 1930s. We either can remain divided and make names at each other, and this goes for the Americans about the 51st state, which is wrong and should be totally disabled. It should be totally gotten rid of, because Canada is not the 51st state. It's its own country and its own personality and its own part as more different than the United States. That Americans need to get through their thick skulls. But we still need each other, because the world is becoming a far unstable place that we haven't seen since just before the outbreak of World War II. We either stand together or we go down together. As I said, I understand Canadians were upset about the tariffs. That is legitimate. This is not the first time that tariffs have been. There was a tariff war between the U.S. and Canada. Around the same time in the 30s, the U.S. imposed a Smoot-Hawley tariff, and Canada got upset, rightfully so. So we either start working these out, and the Americans need to understand that there's a give and take, because the world, as I said, we need each other in these times. So as I conclude, my hope is that more America, maybe a lot of good can come out of this feud between the U.S. and Canada. Americans will learn more about Canada, which they should. The same thing with Mexico, but that's for a different story. But again, my hope is that as certain people move off the stage, people know what I'm saying. As people start moving off the stage, calmer heads will prevail. Thank you. And if there are any Canadian out there, you can always leave me a comment. But just let me say I do appreciate your country, your own country, and the maple flag. And another thing, Americans, which irritates me the most, you do yourself no good by putting the maple flag on when you're American. They will know who you are. Bye.